So, let's get started in the efforts to actually not run over for the first session. This is compliance and governance for a regulated industry. Now, I want to preface one thing. This is that the reason that this is compliance and governance for a regulated industry is that that's the only industry that I've ever worked with. So all of the work that I've done as a professional for my whole career has been in government or regulated industry. Government is the ultimate regulated industry. So there's a lot of different types of regulated industries, regulated markets out there, including the entire, public sector set of businesses. So the way I figure it is that there are two types of folks in this audience right now. Well, there are three. There's the people that were expecting Paul Turner. But for the folks that were looking for this punishment, then you're either in a regulated industry and looking to achieve or improve compliance and governance, or you're not in a regulated industry, but you're interested in how regulated industry is trying to address this issue. Because one of the things that you'll walk away from this session with is Brad really thinks that compliance and governance is extremely important for regulated industry. So, who am I? My name is Brad Smith. I'm the president and CEO of Blackblade Associates. We're a consulting firm based out of Northern Virginia on the East Coast of the United States, right next to Washington, D.C. Considering my history with the government, I'm sure that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. If you're getting money from the government is where you need to be at. We provide advisory, consulting, and training services, mostly around, in the recent years, governance and compliance, information management. Because it's really easy to find somebody that's willing to install a technology. It's a little harder to find somebody that's willing to come in and show you how you're going to be able to change your process and improve your organization using it. I was a Marine, U.S. Marine, so I apologize for anybody that hasn't been in one of my presentations before for anything I might say that you might find disturbing. I apologize ahead of time. Just pointed out to me afterward that I said something being a jerk, and I will apologize profusely for it. And as I said earlier, my entire background is government and regulated industry. The things that the government and the government of a country has their fingers in. The taxpayers are participating in that effort. So what's our agenda this morning? Well, this is a two-part series. Part one is the one we're about to go through, is defining the problem. For anybody that's been through it, everybody in here probably has been. This is effectively a requirements session. We're going through the process of defining why is governance and compliance something that we should even be talking about. Where's the business case for what I'm going to propose in the second part, which is the solutions for achieving compliance through governance. Why is it so important? Why haven't we achieved it yet? Why is it so hard? How many people here were in my Governance 101 presentation last year? Oh, so. Yes, I remember both of you. So, last year, well, I'll get to it in a little more detail. Last year I delivered a hard message. I did not sugarcoat what governance was. The whole intent behind the session last year was to make sure that if you walked out of that session with anything, you realized that if somebody's walking into your organization saying, governance is easy, just install this, or we have governance out of the box, or governance in a can, or that is being sold to you. Was it The Princess Bride? Or it's like, life is pain. Governance is pain. And anybody else is selling something if they say anything different. But in these sessions, the intent is to work through the process of defining the business case for the requirements around governance and compliance so that you can justify the work that you need to do in it for your organizations. And then the second one, part 2, which is immediately following this one this morning, after a 15-minute break, is talking about solving the problem, the solutioning that you have to do in order to actually implement it. So, asking the right questions. Is that as soon as you learn to ask the right questions, Grasshopper, you'll get your answers? It's not about knowing the answers. Everybody walks in with an answer. Every consultant that you pick up off the street, though I probably shouldn't be getting your consultants from the street or anywhere else, is going to come in with the answer. I have the answer for your organization. Oftentimes they'll lead off with that. Vendors will lead right off with that. How can they possibly have the answer for your organization if they're not the ones that have been dealing with the problem? The only people that can answer the questions that we're going to talk about in the perspective of your organization is your organization, your people. You have to end up with the people that are feeling the pain. They're the ones that are they're the only ones that are going to be able to answer the question, does this solve my problem? And you want to figure that out before you invest millions of dollars in implementing a system and realize that it doesn't actually address the issue. So, what is governance? Remember that? Governance is a road. Governance is a road. It's a path that you're following. And how governed you are determines how far off that road you've gone. Governance 101 last year, there's a video. The video of it is out there. Again, it was decidedly negative because I wanted to make sure everybody understood exactly how hard governance can be and how important it is. And I'm pretty sure everybody walked out of that session saying, my God, I'm not going to implement governance. I don't want to touch that thing. Tough love. I was trying to make sure that everybody understood how difficult it can be and how important it was. But my basic definition of what governance is that it is a process through which you ensure humans don't screw up IT. So there's a lot of debate in the industry around what governance is, what entities are you actually governing, right? Most folks lead in right now, from a technology perspective, they want to sell you technology, they want to sell you a solution, so they say, this is a governed system, and they imply that the system itself is providing its own governance. But then I think that ignores what governance is actually for. If a system is never interacting with any users, it stays governed. It doesn't think on its own, it doesn't change, it doesn't adapt, it just stays exactly in the state that you left it in, assuming that power continues. Governance is needed because you have humans involved in the process. And those humans constantly change the mechanisms, the system, the process, and force it to adapt. And then the system has to communicate with other systems that are communicating with other humans. You're constantly driving systems out of compliance just by being human, by being in there and trying to get your job done, because compliance is not the rest state. I was a scientist. I am a scientist. At least I think I'm still a scientist. But thinking about entropy, right? The rest state for the universe is chaos. It is. Compliance is a fiction. It's an abnormal aspect. Compliance is something that must be forced on reality. That's getting a little more philosophical than I think I want to get in this class, or in this session, or for you guys either. I don't think you guys want to go down that road either. But it's true. Compliance is something that must be maintained. It must be forced. It is not the at-rest state of an organization. The at-rest state of the organization is what most people have a SharePoint implementation do. We call it a lot of things. The wild, wild west. That's what I always call it. I'm sure that there's a pile of other names. But it's ungoverned, uncontrolled, not transparent, no idea what's happening, just letting people do whatever the heck they want. Governance provides compliance. We'll get into that a little bit more, but consistent and repeatable process, the ability to know what's happening in a predictable and repeatable fashion. What is compliance? Well, first I want to talk about two things. External compliance versus internal compliance. Now, again, last year when we talked about Governance 101, the driving message that I had is that if you achieve governance in an organization, generally speaking, that's the only way that you're going to be able to meet ROI and be able to demonstrate ROI, return on investment, return of investment. How does a regulated industry produce an ROI? I mean, I go into a meeting with a bunch of four-star generals at the Pentagon, and I talk about ROI, and they're sitting there looking at me like, what language are you speaking? They're not a for-profit industry. They have no idea what I'm talking about. The best that they've gotten to is total cost of ownership. We're wasting money a little slower than other people. So in a regulated industry, profitability is not priority one. We'll go over that thought a little bit later. But a regulated industry has external compliance. Internal compliance is what you do to measure adoption, security, performance, and ROI, in process improvement. The deltas between this is what we did before, we inserted this technology, we govern that process, and we implement improvement and change, and this is the benefit that we've gotten. And the compliance measures are the SLAs, the guiding structures that you input in your system. Internal, you're trying to get a return on the investment internal to your organization. Nobody external to you is saying you must do that. Most of your competitors would be perfectly fine if you run ungoverned. In a regulated industry, it's not completely different, but it's significantly different because you have external governing bodies. You have a government, right? For the most part, every regulated industry that I interact with, it's regulated because a government has their hands in the process. Either they're making sure that you're forced into a level of compliance, oftentimes which is completely counterintuitive to making money, sometimes on purpose, or it's a government agency or quasi-government agency in and of itself, where it's subsidized by taxpayer dollars. That is external compliance. So there's regulatory compliance and internal IT compliance. The most important part of compliance isn't saying we're compliant. It isn't even really being compliant in an external scenario. It's being able to prove that you're compliant. It's being able to demonstrate and report it as such so that they can walk away and not force you to stop your business, change your business, fire people, remove product, shut down factories, all the things that would damage the mission that you're actually trying to accomplish. Compliance is achieved through governance. Now, this is one of those things where, I say it, with all the people in the community, and people start, raising their hands and saying, oh, I don't know if that's entirely accurate. This is, again, from my experience, the way that you achieve compliance. Compliance is an end state of governance. If you can control your system, your people, and the mechanisms that are being used to generate information, if you can manage information, that allows you to achieve compliance. If you can't do those basic things, you will not be able to achieve compliance. You cannot achieve compliance without governance. Or, let me preface that. So how, in organizations like the military, the U.S. military right now, I can guarantee you, IT governance is not being maintained. They run ungoverned. The government runs ungoverned. I'm sure that's a surprise. They're inefficient, bureaucracy. They run ungoverned a lot. And so how do they achieve compliance? You can achieve compliance without governance, but you can't maintain it. You can't stay in compliance. So what they do is that every 2-3 years, in the military anyway, they'll come through and do an audit and inspection. The IG, the Inspector General's office, will come out and say, prepare yourself, we're going to do an audit and make sure you're in compliance with everything. And they'll spend 6-8 months just burning their people for 12, 16 hours a day, manually getting everything into compliance. And just in time for the report, they'll get their score, they'll say, great, you have this level of compliance, and then they'll just throw everything away until the next time that the IG schedules another audit. So my perspective is that you can brute force compliance if you have to, but in order to maintain it in a cost-effective manner, you have to have governance to maintain compliance. So those checkpoints, if they come in and they don't give you 6 to 8 months to do a review, or something goes wrong. Does anybody here work for or work with or for BP? Something went wrong. Something went wrong. And all of a sudden, they didn't have all that lead time to make sure that they were compliant with their information. Their records were maintained. All that information about how that well was built and run was available and transparent. They didn't have that lead time. When something goes wrong, the lead time that you hope that you have just to get past the compliance investigation or the scheduled compliance review is no longer there. You have to be compliant then. If you can't maintain compliance through governance, then you're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to be able to brute force it. Why is compliance so important for regulated industries? It's a little Orwellian, but that's exactly right. The government of whatever country or region that you're in is forcing a set of external compliance regulations on your organization. And this goes back to what I was talking about. With external compliance required in regulated industry, is profitability priority one? I think it can be debated. It depends on particular perspectives. Obviously, oil and gas companies, commodities companies, mining companies, there are regulatory compliance measures that they have to follow, and profitability is important. They're doing it because they're trying to make money, and their shareholders want them to make money. But if they do it outside of regulation, they won't make a cent, and in fact, they'll have to pay money back, and most of the time, the people that were trying to do it will end up in prison. So when you look at it from that perspective, they can only make profit. They will only be able to make profit. They identify when they go into that business and they stay in that business that the only way to make profit is to stay in compliance. So I would posit that compliance is priority one. Everything else falls apart if they can't stay compliant. And so it goes to show that if governance is really the process that you use to maintain compliance over time, then governance should be important to a regulated industry. So this goes into risk management. Who here knows John Holliday? Anybody has had an opportunity to see him present or read any of his books? SharePoint Records Management 2001, SharePoint Records Management 2003, SharePoint Records Management 2007, SharePoint Records Management 2010. He's the industry expert in records management. But one of the conversations that he and I have all the time is what are we actually talking about when we talk about compliance and governance and records management? It's risk management. I mean, in the end, the reason that you try to run in a governed fashion, the reason you achieve compliance, external or internal, it's all about risk management. It's about reducing your risk. It's about ensuring that you're not running in an environment where the risk exceeds the value. You have to be able to keep and mitigate those risks down, which means you have to be able to identify them and you have to be able to treat them, mitigate them. Risk management can only be achieved through governance. And when your risk is managed to the level that your organization requires, you have achieved compliance. If you are not in compliance with the external regulation, that means that you haven't managed your risk. Not being in compliance is the risk. Different set of requirements, which means that regulated industry structures their IT processes and projects and organizations differently, right? You see processes like CMMI, ISO 9000, ISO 20000. These structures that are designed to set up the processes and rules in your organization to make sure you don't start going off the reservation. You maintain and achieve compliance. Why aren't we already compliant? I mean, these IT systems out there all talk about the level of governance that are built into the platforms, built into the technology. You're not compliant because of humans. We're all human. Some of us are human. Human interaction will constantly drive any IT system out of compliance. Because then, compliance is not the natural state. Humans need to collaborate. They need to create. They need to have a mechanism for them to come up with ideas and then formulate those ideas into opinions and formulate those opinions into action. And you will not be able to do that and maintain compliance, which is why you have a constant governing process, a constant governing requirement where you have to constantly move your processes back into compliance. You're not in compliance because of you, the human. So this is the other thing. One of the reasons I like using governance as a road, right? It's a never-ending process. It's not a destination. Compliance is not a destination. It's a moving target. Regulations never change, right? Political winds never shift. Competitive realities never alter. Small businesses never rise up to take on large ones in ways that they couldn't possibly imagine. The targets move. It's a never-ending process. And because humans are interacting with the system, you're never going to be 100% compliant, but you have to be able to prove you've gotten as close as possible. And the minute you stop governing, the minute you stop moving those processes forward, you fall out of compliance very rapidly. It varies depending upon the context, what level of compliance, what level of regulation. But it is a continual process, which is why it's so burdensome, right? It's burdensome because it's continual. The reason that people don't have a lot of this already is because the reason that organizations don't have a full level of compliance. I had a discussion with Andrew Connell and John Holliday last night and Steve Smith, and we all agreed that we're pretty sure that nobody in the entire world actually has what would be called fully digital records management. Does anybody here think they have that? I mean, like full compliant records management in their organizations or in any organization they've served? Anyone? I have never seen it. Never. It's never been fully managed. It's never been fully executed. It's never been fully adopted. The compliance is never all the way there. It's impossible for that to happen because there's some information during the creation process that just cannot be compliant by its very nature. So that road, it's a moving target. Keep on pushing governance. The compliance target keeps on moving out. The finish line's always should be within view at least, but it's always just a little farther than you are. Why is it so hard? Why did I have to have that tough love discussion last year where I'm telling everybody how difficult governance is to achieve and how impossible it is to pick it up and run with it if you don't understand it, even if you do understand it? I think that this is the key, this first item here. I think the reason why governed IT systems are so difficult to achieve is that you have to be able to find everything you have in your organization, all the information related to your process operation, your IT process. And you have to have it identified. Now let me back up that just a little bit. I think one of the funniest things that I hear in meetings with regulated industries or government organizations is when somebody comes in and says, well, we need to tag everything, we need to identify everything in order to be able to know what it is and be able to know whether or not it's a record or whether or not it's a, this kind of document or whether or not it's that kind of document and be able to assign the policies appropriately. Great. All we need to do is get everything into SharePoint. Is every piece of information in your organization in SharePoint? Everything? Is it ever going to be? It will never be in one system. How much of your records, your cases that are being declared that have policies associated with them are in email? How many of them are in IM? How many of them are voice conversations? How many of them are meetings? How many of them are printed documents, physical hard copy? In order to have a governed system and to be in full compliance, you need to right then, right at that moment, know everything about all of your data. It's not possible, is it? Because it's always changing. The minute you know one snapshot, 30 seconds later, somebody's changed something somewhere. The science thing, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, right? You can only know where something's going and know what it is at that one snapshot, but you can't know both at the same time. So it's just too much. And most systems in this market cannot dynamically identify things for you. It's required for user-driven. Does everybody like it when they upload a document into a SharePoint library and they see 30 metadata fields with a little red star next to them that says you must put these in? Or if you guys actually like that punishment, do any of your users come back and say thank you for ensuring that I don't forget to put in those metadata fields? Most of the time they just keep them on their desktop, or they find a library that's out of compliance and they just upload it there. They say, well, we'll worry about it later. Or, my favorite, the ASDF, ASDF, ASDF. Just random keys. Just whatever they have. Identifying content is difficult. And until recently, I would have said that is there's only so far that technology can take you. Now, there have been some great advancements around this, and I'll talk about this in the solutioning session. So if you guys want to hear the answers, you're going to have to go to my next presentation. But the identification of information is the first step. You cannot have governance, which is achieved through policy, to drive compliance with that policy, unless you know what something is, because if you don't know what something is, you can't assign the right policy. That's why I think governance is so difficult. It's probably not the only reason, but it's definitely, I think, the most difficult to achieve. So policy mapping means that you have to know what everything is, and then there's the reality that people don't like to be governed. Do they? Nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, I can't wait until somebody tells me everything I'm doing wrong and tells me the right way to do it, and it's going to take me twice as long as I expected. I mean, at least I hope none of you wake up and think that. Nobody wants to be governed. Humans love governing things and hate to be governed. We are by nature rebellious against control. So, how do we get around that? I'll talk about it again in the solutioning session a little bit more, but it is a little Orwellian, George Orwell. You have to make governance invisible, transparent to them, so they understand that they're in compliance, but they don't feel like they have to do anything about it, and you have to make it feel good. You have to make it so that they get addicted to governance. How do you do that in an IT system? It's all about the user experience, right? Let me give you an example, stepping back to what I talked about for a moment, right? That page of 30 metadata fields with the little red stars right next to them. You could take that exact same page, and if you had technology filling in suggestions for each of those, instead of just leaving the difference between a blank text box with a button next to it, even with the buttons next to it to search for stuff, and a text box with a suggestion that they could still change, is mind-boggling. Because then, even though they're being guided, even though they're being led, even though they're being governed, they feel like they're in control because they're making a choice. Now, one would say, they can make a choice with a blank text box, right? But that's not the way the human mind works. They, at that point, feel that they have to create. And the minute that they're being forced to do something that they didn't want to do, or they didn't intend to do, or they don't desire to do, then they feel like they're being led. They're being yanked. But if you guide them gently, little strokes, then they end up feeling like they're in charge even when they're not. You have to make it pleasant to be governed. So if anybody hasn't read, 1984 by George Orwell? Who's read that book? Anyone? Oh, yeah, there you go. Who hasn't, really? The key for governance, restrictive governance, is to make it pleasurable for the users. And that is a technology problem in IT. That is a technology problem. But we're not getting into that here. We're still building the requirements, right? Our requirements, it has to be transparent, not completely missing. They need to know it exists, but it has to be transparent and pleasurable. Why do we always have to update our governance plan? I think we've talked about this already. You could also look at it as gravity, right? If you don't apply a force opposing gravity, then we all know where things roll. So the aspect of governance, the tough love scenario, is that it's always an uphill push. You're going to always, you can never stop. You can never coast. There isn't the natural inertia for an IT system that has humans using it is against governance, against compliance. So it's a constant pressure. You have to build a positive pressure where you're always moving forward. You're always pushing governance and compliance more than the chaos is pushing back. The other thing, and this leads into one of the difficulties with knowing your information, is your policy for data can change during the life cycle of that information, even if the information itself doesn't. Information isn't siloed. It's not in a vacuum. That one document, it doesn't live by itself. Its policy and security context can change depending upon other related content in the system or outside the system. And then your policies change. This is especially specific in the classified environment, right? Inside the U.S. government. Or any government, really. I'm sure the Ministry of Defense has plenty of security measures, too. The aggregate security risk, right? An individual document can be open to the public, available for everybody to consume and see. But when you combine it with 10,000 other documents about similar information and they can produce an aggregate picture that puts the government's agents at risk, then suddenly that aggregate volume of data becomes classified. The risk of information can change depending upon the perspective that it's provided. You see this in business intelligence. The cube, right? It's all about which direction you're drilling into that data, and all of a sudden the decisions you're making change completely, and the criticality of a piece of data that you thought was unimportant suddenly becomes the most important, simply by shifting the perspective that you're reporting on it. Policy and the context, policy and the risk of information that you're trying to manage changes constantly. And oftentimes is not even driven by the changing of that information itself. That's another reason why records management is so very difficult to achieve. Is the minute that you snapshot a record, the possibility that record is going to be a record 10 years from now, 15 years from now, is not solely dependent on that content itself. Or information that wasn't declared as a record, information that that was assessed as a non-risk scenario, something that we don't have to worry about managing the disposition of or the retention of, suddenly changes when an oil rig blows up, or a plane crashes, or a war starts. So none of this stuff stays still. It's constantly changing. The context is constantly moving. As information risk changes, as the risk that data presents changes, the policy in the IT system has to adapt. And this is the second reason why I think it's so hard to achieve, why it's so difficult for most organizations to achieve governance and compliance in IT systems, is because technology especially knowledge management technology, while there are tools that allow you to build adaptation into it, evolution, so it can intelligently change, those are difficult to build. Workflow, heuristic search, automated anything. Those are difficult to build, and they're expensive to build. And as a result, people instead rely on what they can always fall back on, which is a lot of hands. But then how do you get that out? How do you formalize that? How do you structure that into a cost-effective process of governance moving forward? And that's why we're talking. I want to make a clarification. Make sure that a couple of points are clear and you walk away with it. Governance is not the objective. It's not the objective to achieve governance just because you want governance. The reason that you need governance is because you have to have compliance. At least in regulated industry, it's required. You will not do business and you will all go to jail if you don't do this. Governance, it's in and of itself, has no value. Governance has value because of what it can produce, which is compliance. Either internal, for the benefit of the organization, or external, for regulatory compliance. And the level of compliance you achieve depends on the effectiveness of your governance process. For records specifically, a percentage that's been kicked around in the industry is that the target for records compliance, for the risk and the retention being managed, is at any point should be around 85%. 85% of the data that you have in your organization that poses a risk in terms of retention. Either it's being kept too long or it's not being kept long enough, is about 85%. That's about the target that you can cost effectively execute against. Now, I think that percentage is going to increase as technology evolves, but only if we incorporate that technology appropriately into the scopes of our technical implementations, which is what we get into in the next session. So, what does our solution need to provide? So what was my first bullet? Why do I think governance is so difficult? What's the one thing that I think is one of the hardest things for us to do in IT? What's that first bullet? Anybody? Volunteer? Volunteer? The what? Well, finding and identifying, knowing the data, right? It's not just finding it. You know, we solved that problem, right? How many search solutions have you all implemented? There's been a few in my background. And my customers just keep on implementing them over and over and over again. Well, this search will work better than that search. In the end, they all do the same thing with minor variations. The first step to identifying your data, your information, is you have to find it. So, any governed institution, any governance process for any organization out there is going to start with finding, findability. There's a pile of presentations every single year at this conference from some of the sharpest people in the world around search and retrievability. And there's a lot of very interesting technologies out there that do it. Fast, the Visimo, autonomy. Who here has played with autonomy before or has to interact with that on a regular basis? I apologize. I've known those guys for a long time. $1.3 million per server, recurring. Why didn't I come up with that business model? So you got to locate your information, and then you have to identify it. And there are two parts to this. First, you have to be able to identify what it is, and second, you have to find a way to persist that determination. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to, in knowledge management, the concept that you use to retain the identification of information? It's one term. We say, everybody says it almost every day in this industry. Most people don't even understand the concept, or it's not present in their minds when they're mentioning it as part of that conversation. But it's the linchpin to all of this in knowledge management. Taxonomy is this mechanism is how you retain taxonomy identification. Those fields in that list, metadata, data about data. What is the identity of an piece of information? That's information about that information. That reminds me real fast, as one of the more amusing conversations I've had recently was with a government agency that wanted to start declaring the metadata about records as records to ensure that they didn't lose that. So, right, identifying the content is twofold. You have to have a mechanism for determining what it is, and the second is you have to have a mechanism for retaining that determination. So in the solutioning section, I'm going to talk about this. I think that this is probably one of the key elements that many of you might be missing in your solutions and in your processes as you're trying to actually identify and govern your IT systems, is that I truly feel that, well, let me preface it. You can achieve governance and identity management and identifying your content the same way that you've always done it before, which is eventually it's got to be presented to a human that has the appropriate training to know what it is and then to make that identification. You can do that. I would suggest the possibility that that is not a sustainable method of executing that process. You cannot rely on a human seeing, touching, and selecting the identity of every single piece of information in your organization, because there are organizations that compete with you out there that are doing things faster. So once we know what it is, we have to have a mechanism. Our system has to be able to assign the appropriate policy. And then there's a couple of different things that go into that, right? So we know the identity of our information, right? But how do we know, after we know what something is, what policy to assign to it? That is a taxonomy and an ontology. That's not those things specifically, but that's what you use, right? The mapping of information in your organization, the taxonomy, where it is, the ontology, what it is. That's taxonomy and ontology in a really, really concise statement. It's where it is and what it is. When you have those things, you need to map the appropriate policies. How do you do that in records management? How do you do that in records management? Anybody? What is the document typically that you have that maps what something is to the appropriate retention policy?
Register plan.
Right. Yep. And the disposition schedule, your RDS. So the records disposition schedule is a mapping of policy to information. Policy doesn't have to just be retention either. We're talking about the actions that must be taken, the policy of risk management for that particular piece of information. Security is an extremely common one as well. I mean, in fact, that's where most people start. Is, well, we don't really know what something is, but we know we don't want people looking at it, so they lock it down. So, security policy, information policy, retention policy, publishing policy, interaction policy, accession policy. You can't assign those until you know what it is, and you can't assign the right policy until you've mapped those policies to your taxonomy, so that when you have identified the data, you assign the correct policy. And your system has to be able to do that. It has to be able to assign the policy through metadata so that it persists with the information. But even then, that's just the first step. All the way up until here, we're just knowing our stuff better. In the end, our system has to be able to execute the policies. For instance, if it's a security policy, it has to be able to assure that the people that do have access, and the people that don't have access, don't have access. That simple. Now, most systems can do that. But in the case of disposition or a session, something needs to move to this formal governing body at a certain state of its content lifecycle. Great. The system has to be able to do that. Identify when something needs to occur and then execute that policy. And then the key, right? The one that people like to forget sometimes. All the way up until the inspector is sitting in front of you and you're feeling like you've just visited the proctologist. That auditing. You have to be able to prove it. All of this is irrelevant, especially in a regulated industry. All of this is irrelevant unless you can prove that it happened. You have to show every step of it. You have to audit it. One of the most frustrating things I hear constantly about storage manipulation, right? We're talking about the modern day, right? How cheap is storage per gigabyte compared to what it was 15 years ago? I mean, anybody that comes in and says, well, our auditing database is small, we can maintain it small. The one thing that you should almost never truncate in an organization, right? You can truncate your data, you can dispose of records, you can archive information off onto tape, but the one thing that you should never truncate is your audit database. You should never do that. That's the proof that you did your job, that they did their job, that your organization did its job, and you don't all go to jail. That is a record. It's the proof that something happened. Auditing. So the system has to be able to audit their actions. So, in the end, if we can find our information, identify its location, identify what it is, map the appropriate policy to that information based on what it is, assign and execute the policies we've just assigned so that it doesn't just know what needs to be done, but it actually does it. And then we have an audit log, a record of everything that's happening in that content management system. Then compliance can be maintained and risk is mitigated as a result. So that's the end state, right? The end state scenario is compliance is maintained and we've mitigated risk. So what are the conclusions that we've come to? If you walk out of this session with any other pieces of information, this is what I want you to walk out with. Governance is driven by finding and identifying data, by finding and identifying your information. You cannot know what the risk something is and what it poses to your organization and therefore come up with a mechanism to mitigate it unless you know what it is, where it is, and what it is. It's the linchpin. It's the holy grail for now, until another holy grail comes up. Governance needs technology to be effectively implemented from a submergence perspective, and I'll talk about that in the next technology, but we've talked about that. The Orwellian pleasantry, so that you're smiling about being ruled, you're smiling about being governed. It's pleasant for you. And your users. And it's invisible. Effective governance and being able to prove it. Don't forget this. Because that's the thing. All of these are also governance mechanisms in and of themselves. If you are going through the development of an IT system, the implementation of an IT solution, of a content lifecycle management solution, and at any point you come across something that you wouldn't be able to audit, that you wouldn't be able to prove, which is typically almost always human, if something's moved out of the system and it's happening inside somebody's head, you need to identify those points, because that is the time when you need to get a signature. That's when somebody's taking culpability for that action, when it's being taken outside of your auditing and control. if you're governing the implementation of your solution by ensuring that at each stage, this is something I can audit, this is something I'll be able to prove, it will do well. You'll do well with it. You'll benefit from that process. So, I don't even know what time I have. How far, did I go through this too fast? Too slow? Where am I? No, 10 minutes left. 10 minutes for questions.